Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Stephen Schneider, the 2007-2008 Clark Lecturer. Stephen Schneider is a world-renowned researcher on climate change and global warming. He is a professor of biology and environmental studies at Stanford. He's an active participant on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the scientific group that shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore. He has served as a consultant for federal agencies through the last 6 presidential administrations. He's a MacArthur Fellow and a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the author of hundreds of scientific papers, and the founder and editor of the journal Climactic Change. He has authored or edited several books, including Climate Change Policy, a Survey, published in 2002. Thanks very much for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Steve.
So you were one of the early voices warning about that the planet's life support system was in trouble, and I'm wondering what sort of reception your prophetic warnings received.
Well, my earliest prophetic warnings were sort of anti-reality. We were more worried about cooling in 1970 than we were about warming. We were worried about change away from normal. Mm-hmm. We knew that the system is locked into the current condition. We've had 10,000 years of relatively steady weather and climate, and that human civilization evolved during that period, and we were worried that the dust and smoke generated from pollution and biomass burning was going to reflect away so much sunlight it would cool the earth down. We also knew that we were dumping carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's a heat-trapping gas, a so-called greenhouse gas. Back then we didn't know who was going to win. It looked like the dust was going to win. Early calculations suggested it. And then we learned really quickly dust and smoke, because of pollution controls, were becoming limited to just polluted cities and biomass burning areas. And not only were the greenhouse gases global, but it wasn't just CO2. There was methane, nitrous oxide, the whole new chemicals, the chlorofluorocarbons, the guys that are bad for the ozone, also happened to trap heat and add to the greenhouse. So by the mid-1970s, we knew that warming was much more likely than cooling. And we started trying to get the society to pay attention to this very, very long-term intergenerational problem. Societies are not good at working on intergenerational problems, so we're still working on it here 35 years later.
So when you switched from cooling to warming, did people say, well, make up your mind about this?
I still hear that. George Will, the conservative columnist, said, oh, Schneider's a joke. He's an environmentalist for all temperatures. And my retort was, can you imagine a doctor who a patient comes in with shaking, chills, and fever, and they make an initial diagnosis of pneumonia but don't bother to test it. Or they test it and the tests come back and it says, no, it's malaria, but stays with the original diagnosis to be politically consistent. We're honest in science. We have hypotheses, we test them, we move on, and we change our minds. And what I was most proud of in that episode, and I really am very proud of it, is I'm the one who figured out what was wrong with the original diagnosis, that warming was more likely, and I published it way ahead of the critics. So I don't have any trail to cover on that. What we're proud of is we're evidence-based. We're not ideologically based. We don't come up with conclusions based upon our personal preferences. We come up with conclusions based on the preponderance of evidence.
So where is Will now on this issue?
Will is where he always was, thinking entrepreneurial rights trump anything and everything else, and therefore continuing to argue that the problem isn't proved because he doesn't want to see regulations on the coal industry in Detroit and other kinds of stuff. So what he's doing is very non-scientific and classically ideological political.
So tell us now about the Global Climate Coalition.
Well, there was, after the 1988 heat waves, your younger viewers won't remember that. But those of us my age and even quite a bit younger will remember this was a mega heat wave in '88. And that took this climate problem from what I like to think of as the left brain, you know, the thinking part of 1,000 of us, to the right brain, the visceral, emotional part of 1 million. And they were talking climate policy. They were talking controls on tailpipe emissions. They were talking getting less polluting power plants, getting people to have real efficiency standards in their houses, replace their inefficient bulbs with compact fluorescents. We're talking 20 years ago. So what happened is the industry organized something called the Global Climate Coalition, which you asked about, Steve.
Now, which industry?
The fossil fuel industry, coal, oil, gas, big cars. And what they did is they repositioned the debate by focusing on the elements of it that were legitimately uncertain, but inflating that uncertainty into saying that absolutely nobody knew anything and completely ignoring the 50% of the problem that was well established, pretending that the 50% that we didn't understand trumped everything we knew. Exactly the same tactic the American Tobacco Institute used for 30 years by saying, but there are 3 studies which are equivocal, and ignoring the 300 that were definitive. So that what they were doing is ignoring the 1,000 studies that said we got a problem and focusing on the 10 that said, well, we're not sure of this. And they were very successful for over 10 years, 15 years. They blocked policy. Now they're gone because the corporates have abandoned them, as most modern large corporations now realize they have an obligation to do something, and they want to do something.
So there is a different, talk about that. So the climate, in a sense, has changed among corporations.
In fact, the Congress now is on the verge of passing climate legislation. This president won't sign it, but this president is a lame duck. And any one of the 3 leading candidates now have said they're going to sign climate legislation. So we've got a major improvement. But how come the Congress is able to have 59 senators now supporting climate legislation, whereas only 10 years ago, 95 to nothing, they voted that they didn't want to have it? The big change, Katrina, let's give Al Gore some credit through the movie, massive heat waves in Europe, fires in the West, melting of the Arctic. It's changed people's consciousness. And the corporate part that you mentioned, Stephen, you said, is there a climate change in corporations? Absolutely, because it allowed a formerly endangered species to come out of the closet in Washington, the moderate Republican. They now exist, and they've actually joined forces with a number of the Democrats, except the dyed-in-the-wool coal state, auto state Democrats, and together they form a majority for much more sensible action. So sooner or later, we can get politically sensible. It just wasted 20 years getting there.
Well, you mentioned Katrina, a tipping point, as it were. But are there those who even say that we don't know about Katrina and that it's a rather fortuitous event that you've got this, or even, I guess, 88, was that when Chicago, was that when the older people were dying massively or great numbers in Chicago? I mean, people might say, well, this is just random. How can you actually tie it to a pattern?
You can never tie any one event to a pattern. The superheat wave in 88 could not be attributed to global warming any more than the cold January and February of 2008 proves that global warming doesn't exist. They're both nonsense. What 88 was a demonstration of our vulnerability to heat, which is predicted to happen with increasing frequency. Climate change is like taking dice. Dice, you have hot and cool and wet and dry faces, and erasing some of the cool and wet and replacing them with more hot and dry, or extremes of drought and flood. You're still going to get all this bouncy variability, but you're going to get more of it. So it's loading the dice onto the heat waves. So 88 was, if you will, it was the canary in the coal mine starting to quiver. And it was a warning more so than an absolute proof. And people recognize that, and that's why we started moving toward climate policy. That's why the industry organized a disinformation campaign to block it. Now the industry is no longer doing that. So we're starting to converge, and we're getting somewhere. But nobody should ever believe that one bit of evidence proves or disproves global warming. It's a preponderance of evidence. Remember the Clinton campaign in 1992 when James Carville gave him the prescription, and he said, it's the economy, stupid. Well, it's the preponderance, stupid. You can't say, oh, I found something that contradicts the mainstream evidence, therefore I've disproved it. That's complete nonsense. It's built upon the preponderance studies, just like with the tobacco story. You could find 2 or 3 studies that didn't fit. You can't ignore the 200 or 300 that do. It's the same story here.
But are there people that need to be convinced at this moment to move this movement further and make it more effective and efficient before we confront catastrophe.
There are always denialists in every problem. How many denialists are there who believe that the Earth is 4,000 years old, which is so overwhelmingly contradicted by the vast preponderance of evidence? You cannot accept that and be a scientist, because scientists have to be driven by evidence. It's the same story. Warming is unequivocal, is what IPCC said. The last 50 years, most of the warming is due to human activities. What'll happen to precipitation in the wintertime in Oregon, that's speculative. So we have some parts of it that are well established that will be virtually certain to occur, other parts with competing explanations, and yet other parts speculative. And in the political and the public debate, they get all conflated, they get all mixed up. And that's why people are legitimately confused. And you have to remember to separate out the stuff we know for sure from the stuff that's still speculative, and the stuff that's still speculative does not trump the stuff that we know for sure.
Right. But my question is, do more people need to be convinced to move forward and to deal with this crisis, or do we have enough people who are on board now to move forward in a way in which we can avert catastrophe?
We have something like 400 cities which have declared that they're going to have a Kyoto Protocol policy. That is, they're going to cut back to the emissions levels of 20 years ago. Why? Because it's good business. Because they're saving money. They're doing well by doing good. The first basic good principle of capitalism. Align your interests, make money, and do the right thing, and everybody is happy. Unfortunately, we can only cut 20% of our emissions that way, and we have to cut 80%, but it's certainly nothing wrong with getting started. We've got 25 states with climate policies. We have the Congress now almost on the verge of passing a climate policy. The only holdout is the West Wing of the White House. They have to be convinced they're not going to change, and they're not going to be there. It doesn't matter what they think, because the next president will have a very different view.
Right. But we also have other countries in the world. We have China, we have India. I know that we're responsible for a disproportionate amount of this pollution and greenhouse gases. But can we deal with this issue when we have other large powers, economic powers, that are not on board?
Yeah, Steve, you put your finger on a very important problem. If you go to an international meeting, and I do them all the time, you end up hearing two sides non-communicating. So first you'll hear from India and China and plenty of other poor countries, but those countries are the most vocal because they're now in rapid development, and they view climate change as a bit of a threat to their plans to get richer, just like we did. We used the Victorian Industrial Revolution with sweatshops and coal burning and internal combustion engines to get rich. Now they think, wait a minute, now you've invented climate change as a plot against us doing the same thing so you can maintain market share. But the truth is, and they know it because they participate in IPCC and they know it to be true, a poor country in a hot climate is much more vulnerable to climate change than a rich country in a cold climate like us. So in a way, they're caught twice. They're damned if they do and damned if they don't, because if they don't, then they're going to be hurt more by the enhanced typhoons because they have so many people living in low-lying cities and their mega deltas. And if they do, then they're going to be hurt by reducing their economy. So how do you get out of this dilemma? They have to leapfrog over the Victorian Industrial Revolution to high technology, over coal to gas, to solar thermal, over internal combustion engine cars to electric or hybrid or some other form of vehicles. That can all be done, but it's going to require cooperative solutions between us with the money and the technology and them with the markets and the need. So if we can get leadership to lead to cooperation, we can actually start to solve this problem and make some money in the process. But at the moment, the leadership is blocking it instead of encouraging it. So to get cooperative strategies, people have to trust each other. You don't build trust when the largest polluter in the world, historically, us, walked out of the Kyoto process and substituted nothing.
Right. So, are you hopeful that we can change the momentum with the new administration in terms of precisely what you're saying, getting India, China on board?
I think it's virtually certain with the new administration.
Any new administration, any of the possible three.
Obama, right, Clinton, or McCain. McCain, let's give him credit on climate change. He was out earlier than Obama and Clinton with real policy. So he's on board for that. He's trying to act more conservative than he really is for obvious reasons in the party he's in. But on environmental issues, he's really been quite out there. So any one of those three is going to have action. There's now 59 senators in the Congress, a majority in the House, and this is going to be law, and it's going to get signed by the president. The question is whether it's going to be a weak law or a strong, good one. And the question is whether it's going to be insular, only looking at America, or whether it's going to have outreach to India, China, Mexico, Indonesia, Brazil, the main players, because without that, it'll only be partially effective. I'm going to start with America because we've got to do our share to have any credibility, but it's got to move quickly beyond that to international cooperation, which is not only going to help with climate and environment, but it's also going to help with terrorism and other things. Because it's amazing how when people cooperate on one issue, they tend to cooperate on others too.
So let's get a scenario here. So the best case scenario, you get an administration, new administration in that is going to push for legislation passed by the United States with the most globally effective reach possible. Then what? Then how do you get the other powers, economic powers, on board? What is the body that adjudicates those kind of treaties?
Well, economic powers called Europe and Japan and now Australia are already on board. They're trying to drag the reluctant United States with them. So we don't have to convince them. We have to join them. The problem is going to be getting the developing countries who say, we are a factor of 10 per person less polluting than you are, therefore we're going to catch up to you, then we're going to take a target. But that's a train wreck, because if you multiply their very large population times an American standard of living, you've got a tripling or quadrupling of CO2, which is a sustainability disaster. So therefore what we have to do is we have to have them, as we said earlier, leapfrog over the old ways of doing things, so that with their larger numbers of people, they're going to have less polluting technologies. That's going to require spending hundreds of billions of dollars to get there. But that's actually not as much money as it sounds like, because it's a small fraction of the growth rate of the economy. This economy and the planet grows $1 trillion a year. The U.S. economy grows $100 billion or more. We need to use some of that growth rate to make the world sustainable. It seems like a pretty good investment.
What about the Olympics? Is the Olympics a chance? I mean, you're going to have a lot of people over there in Beijing. It's hard for me to imagine that they're going to try to be able to pretend that the pollution doesn't exist and these multiple ring roads around that capital. Isn't that a really wonderful opportunity for people to do something from an international perspective?
Yeah, you know, Steve, I've heard China talk about this. First, they deny there's going to be any problem, everything will be fine. They know full well that there's the potential for a major embarrassment if they get one of their white sky, even though the sun is shining, heavily coal-driven, air-polluted days. If they get a stagnant air mass over them, that's just bad luck with the weather. With all the junk that they're dumping in it, I don't know, runners might be coughing. So it's going to be an embarrassment, and maybe they need a little embarrassment to get them to be more cooperative in these leapfrogging schemes, because we got to help finance it and think our way out of the problem. We literally have to invent our way out of this problem. But we can't do it with private investment alone, because they want a guaranteed low-risk return on investment. So we need some public loan guarantees and other ways to get a cooperative partnership between the public and private sector. And then we have to take it overseas with shared patents. We have to be creative. Let's get creative, and we can solve the problem. We don't get creative, we're going to have to adapt to the problem, and it gets very difficult to adapt to it if it warms up more than another few degrees. And we're headed to more than a few. We're headed to 5 to 10.
Right. Now, we're speaking here in sort of global terms. We're talking about corporations. Is there anything that individuals can do? I mean, I've heard that the carbon emissions from hybrid cars are not really doing that much to reduce greenhouse gases. I don't know if that's true or not, which is, if it is true, sort of demoralizing. I mean, is the kind of stuff we can do on a personal basis just sort of kind of making us feel good, or are there ways in which each individual can change habits to make a difference in the big picture?
Well, when you tell your kids shut the light out when you leave the room, sounds very preachy, but in fact it's absolutely necessary, because that decision made by one kid doesn't make any difference. But when that decision, in the culture that you're training people to do, is going to be made by 1 billion kids 10 times a day, it makes a difference. And when you plan your trips, you just go out anytime you feel like it, or do you think, no, Johnny, I'm going to take you to friends in a half an hour, and I'm going to go to my shopping a half an hour earlier than I wanted to do, so I make 1 trip instead of 2. That saves money, that saves the environment, that puts it together. And yes, the hybrid car is much more efficient than the other kinds of cars. What you're talking about was a fraudulent website that said that Hummers were as energy efficient as Priuses. And then if you dug under it and you actually looked it up, you found out they made the assumption that Hummers drive 400,000 miles and Priuses drive 80,000 miles. And since it takes energy to build a car, and they used the Prius a fifth as much as they used the Hummer, they said it was a wash. That's absolutely not true, because the data shows that large Detroit automobiles do not last longer than small Japanese ones. It's rather the opposite. So it was a double lie. It was just designed to protect the industry. And people make all kinds of claims all the time, and they expect the public not to look it up. So yes, we can make a difference. Now, you and I can't negotiate with the Chinese. That our government has to do for us. But we can certainly send political signals to our government that we want them to, by not voting for those who are in denial, and by forming neighborhood groups which then link with other groups. And those coalitions of organizations that want political action make a difference. That's how the civil rights movement got going. It takes a generation, and we're now halfway there, and we're on the track. And you know what? Our kids want it. And when we see that our kids want it, then we tend to do it a lot more enthusiastically.
So are you then optimistic that changes are going to occur? I guess it's dangerous to just sort of say that.
Optimism, pessimism. You know, I like to give an analogy. Remember back in the 80s when we were talking about banning ozone-depleting substances, the spray cans and the fluids and air conditioners that were causing ozone depletion according to the theory. All of a sudden the ozone hole occurred. Oh my God, the theory was right. And we, in less than a year, got a Montreal Protocol that banned half the substances. We then sent a team to the Antarctica, and they found out that we really did do it, the ozone hole. And when that happened, we banned 90%. So you could say, hey, the glass is half full. We got an ozone hole. We acted in the world's interest. But it's such a lower fraction of the economy than fossil fuels. And we had to get kicked in the teeth with an ozone hole, and we knew for 20 years that something was going to happen. So let's say that the glass is half empty by saying we had to be kicked in the teeth to act. It's half full that when kicked, we did it. So is Katrina enough of a kick in the teeth? The factor of 4 increase in fires in the western United States? The melting of the Arctic? I sure hope so.
So you're a scientist, and you're also doing this work in prophetic witness through science of what's actually going on. Do we need more of this happening, or do we have enough scientists who are standing up and saying, here are the facts?
We never have enough people out there to counter the, to put it nastily, the forces of darkness. Those are the ones who deliberately select out of the context. Remember, science talks in bell curves. Not so bad, really catastrophic, everything in the middle. So you end up with deep ecology groups going to the end of the world. You have enterprise institutes and the coal and big car industries going over to, well, CO2 is a fertilizer, it's good for green plants, it's good for you, and it would be too expensive to fix it. So you have end of the world and good for you. The two lowest probability outcomes being trumped by special interests, and then the media fighting them off against each other and ignoring everything in the middle, which is much more likely, and not good, but certainly not as wild as those extremes. So we need a lot of scientists out there to continuously remind us that this is not a problem about pitting end of the world versus good for you. It's not like covering political story, you know, get the Democrat, get the Republican. It's about giving the balance. Relative credibility of arguments matters in science. You don't have an equal right to say anything because science is peer-reviewed. That's very different than political blogs where everybody has an equal right. And in the case of science, there is objective standards of evidence, and they have to be given more weight than claims made by special interests who don't want to see rules that are going to hurt their business.
And is there a responsibility for scientists when they see the evidence to come forward with it?
I believe scientists are always required, when asked by legitimate institutions like the media, like congressional testimony or talking to legislators or town councils, to come forward and tell what they believe to be the truth. They should not leave out the caveats. They should not pretend that every component of the problem is well established, because that's not true. But they also have to point out that the components that are speculative do not trump those that are well established. And scientists in polls are still among the most credible witnesses in society. Among the least are corporate PR people and politicians. So I think the public has it right.
I see. So, and what about the media? You've touched on that. How has the media treatment of this issue been, from your perspective?
Well, when people ask me about the media, which is common, my answer is, what's the media? There is NPR and the New York Times and really good public television right here in this state. And they go out of their way to try to be balanced, reasonable, and to report the relative credibility of arguments. Then there's the evening news, which follows formulaic journalism about, well, if somebody says we have a problem, we better get somebody who says it isn't, and I'm not going to figure out which is a more credible position. And unfortunately, the majority of our citizens often get their information from the relatively shallow, formulaic parts of the media. But anybody who wants to can get fair and balanced information, and not in the sense of Fox News, out there if they go and they Google it and they spend a little bit of time. Evening news basically only tells you who's debating what. You can't really believe that that's a balanced argument. You've got to look it up a little more than that.
Well, Steve Schneider, it's been great having you with us. I congratulate you on the great work you're doing. And we're in your debt, and I hope we get out of this.
Well, thank you, Steve. And we are moving progressively, but nobody out there should be too depressed because it takes a generation or so to get out of this problem. Because we're not just talking about conveying some new piece of scientific information. We're talking about cultural change in the perception of us and nature and us and other countries. And that takes an understanding that doesn't emerge instantly. And we're on the road.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching.